The moment the entire prison cafeteria went silent, Derek Collins thought it was because everyone was watching him, but the truth was far stranger, because within seconds the man who believed he ruled that room would realize he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The lunch bell had rung only a minute earlier inside Redstone Women's Correctional Facility, a place where routine was everything and reputation meant survival. Metal trays clattered against the stainless steel counter as inmates moved through the line, the smell of reheated chili and cornbread filling the wide concrete room. Conversations echoed under the high ceiling, loud and restless, the way they always were when hundreds of people who had too much time and too many grudges gathered in one place. At the center of that noise sat Derek Collins, a broad-shouldered inmate who had spent years building a reputation that most people here understood without needing to hear a single word. Derek liked attention, and attention followed him everywhere. Across the room a new inmate stepped into the cafeteria for the first time that afternoon. Her name was Aaliyah Brooks. She moved slowly, calmly, carrying her tray with steady hands while her eyes scanned the unfamiliar room. She was tall, slim, and quiet, the kind of person who didn't seem interested in drawing attention. A few inmates glanced at her, whispering the way people do when someone new enters a place where everyone already knows the rules. New arrivals always stood out. But what made Aaliyah different was the way she walked, not nervous, not hurried, just calm, like someone who had already decided she wasn't going to be intimidated by the noise, the stares, or the tension that hung in the air like humidity before a summer storm. Derek noticed her too. From his seat near the center table he leaned back in his chair, watching the newcomer with a half-smile that had made more than one inmate uncomfortable over the years. People nearby stopped talking. They knew that look. Derek stood up slowly, 6 feet 2 inches of confident swagger as he stepped into the aisle between the tables. His boots scraped against the concrete floor while he moved directly into Aaliyah's path. The room began to quiet. Aaliyah stopped walking. She looked at him once, then lowered her eyes to her tray again as if the interruption wasn't important enough to deserve her attention. A few inmates chuckled under their breath, expecting the usual performance Derek liked to stage whenever someone new arrived. Derek said something short and dismissive, the kind of comment meant to test someone's reaction. Aaliyah didn't respond. She simply stood there, calm and silent, like the noise around her belonged to another world. That silence irritated Derek more than any insult could have. The room grew quieter. Even the guards near the doorway paused for a moment, watching from a distance the way experienced officers do when they sense tension building but haven't yet decided whether they need to step in. Then Derek made a move he would regret almost instantly. The action lasted less than a second, quick enough that many people didn't fully understand what had happened. But what came next changed the atmosphere in the cafeteria completely. Derek suddenly stepped back, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as if something unexpected had just happened to him. A murmur spread through the room. Aaliyah still hadn't raised her voice. She still hadn't shown anger. She simply adjusted her tray, calm as ever, while Derek stared at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. And for the first time since lunch began, the most confident man in the cafeteria realized the quiet girl standing in front of him might not be the easy target he had imagined. The cafeteria did not explode into noise the way it usually did after a moment like that. Instead, the opposite happened. Conversations faded one by one until the only sounds left were trays sliding across tables and the distant hum of the ventilation fans above the ceiling. Derek Collins stood still, staring at Aaliyah Brooks with a puzzled expression that no one in that room had ever seen on his face before. People nearby leaned forward slightly, watching closely, because Derek was not the kind of inmate who ever looked unsure of himself. In the years he had spent inside Redstone Women's Correctional Facility, his reputation had been built on certainty. He spoke loudly, moved confidently, and usually expected the entire room to react exactly the way he predicted. But this moment was different. Something small had shifted in the atmosphere and everyone could feel it. Aaliyah Brooks did not say a single word. She did not argue, complain, or even raise her voice. She simply stood there holding her tray like someone who had accidentally stepped into the wrong conversation and was waiting for it to end. That calm made the situation far stranger than if she had reacted with anger. Derek blinked once, then again, as if trying to understand why the confident rhythm of the cafeteria had suddenly slipped out of his control. A few inmates exchanged quiet looks across the tables. One woman whispered to her cellmate that something about the new girl felt unusual, but she could not explain exactly why. It was the stillness. Most new arrivals either tried to act tough or tried to disappear. Aliyah did neither. She simply existed in the room without reacting to the tension around her. Derek finally forced a short laugh, the kind people use when they want to pretend nothing unusual has happened. The sound echoed a little too loudly across the nearby tables. Some inmates laughed with him out of habit, but the reaction felt forced and thin. Derek shifted his weight and stepped aside slightly, creating just enough space for Aliyah to continue walking if she wanted. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Aliyah calmly walked past him as if the entire encounter had never been important enough to remember. She chose a small empty seat near the far wall of the cafeteria and placed her tray down carefully. Across the room Derek remained standing where she had left him. His confidence returned slowly, but something about the moment lingered in his expression. A few of his usual followers approached him, speaking quietly and trying to turn the situation into a joke. Derek nodded along, though his eyes drifted back toward the far table where Aliyah now sat eating in complete silence. The guards near the doorway resumed their routine patrol, but even they looked slightly curious. Inside a place like Redstone, small changes in the social balance of a room could spread faster than rumors. And whether Derek understood it yet or not, the quiet girl who had just walked past him had already shifted something invisible inside that cafeteria. People continued eating, conversation slowly returned, and trays clattered again across the metal tables. But the energy of the room was no longer the same. Somewhere between the lunch line and the far wall, the unspoken rules of the cafeteria had been quietly interrupted. And for the first time in a long while, everyone in that room realized that the newest inmate inside Redstone might be carrying a story none of them understood yet. The lunch period slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something subtle had changed inside the cafeteria and nearly everyone could feel it even if they could not explain why. Aliyah Brooks sat quietly at the far table near the concrete wall, eating her meal with the same calm focus she had shown since walking into the room. She did not rush and she did not watch anyone else. To most people it looked like she simply wanted to finish lunch and leave. But in a place like Redstone Women's Correctional Facility, quiet behavior rarely stayed unnoticed for long. 2 tables away, a woman named Tanya Morris leaned slightly forward in her seat while pretending to concentrate on her food. Tanya had been inside Redstone for nearly 4 years and she had learned how to read the invisible patterns of prison life the way experienced sailors read the direction of the wind. Her eyes moved between Derek Collins and the new girl near the wall. Derek had finally sat down again, though the confident posture he normally displayed seemed slightly forced. He spoke to a couple of inmates near him, laughing louder than necessary, trying to turn the moment into a joke that everyone could accept. But Tanya noticed something others missed. Derek kept glancing toward Aliyah every few seconds, the way someone might watch a stranger who had just disrupted a familiar routine. Tanya pushed her tray aside and leaned closer to the woman sitting beside her. In a low voice she said that the new girl did not behave like someone who had just entered the toughest housing block in the facility. Most new inmates tried to make friends quickly or avoided attention completely. Aliyah had done neither. She had walked through the cafeteria like someone who had already measured the room and decided it did not intimidate her. Across the room Aliyah finished her drink and set the plastic cup down carefully beside her tray. A few nearby inmates had started watching her openly now. Word traveled fast in a prison environment, and even the smallest unusual moment could become a story before the next bell rang. A woman from the next table over leaned toward another inmate and whispered that the new girl had barely reacted when Derek confronted her. Another inmate replied that maybe she simply did not understand how things worked here yet. But Tanya shook her head slightly. She had seen hundreds of new arrivals pass through this cafeteria and fear always showed itself in one way or another. The hand shook. The eyes moved too quickly. The shoulders tensed. None of those signs had appeared in Aliyah Brooks. Instead she moved with a strange steadiness that suggested patience rather than anxiety. At the center table, Derek finally stopped laughing. His friends continued talking, but his attention had already drifted again toward the far wall. Something about the quiet girl bothered him in a way he could not immediately explain. The moment earlier had lasted less than a heartbeat, yet it felt unfinished somehow. Derek had built his reputation by reading people quickly and reacting faster than anyone expected. But Aliyah had not reacted at all. That absence of reaction created a question that refused to disappear. The loudspeaker above the cafeteria doors crackled slightly as a guard announced that lunch would end in 3 minutes. Chairs began to slide backward as inmates prepared to leave. Aliyah stood up calmly and carried her tray toward the return counter. As she walked across the cafeteria, dozens of eyes followed her without speaking. Derek watched too. And somewhere deep inside the silent curiosity spreading through the room, one quiet thought began forming in more than one mind. Whoever Aliyah Brooks really was, her story inside Redstone had only just begun. The cafeteria doors closed behind the last group of inmates and the echo of metal trays being stacked faded into the background of Redstone Women's Correctional Facility. The afternoon routine began exactly the way it always did. Guards directed the lines back toward the housing blocks while the loudspeaker announced the next movement schedule in a calm mechanical voice. But even as the routine resumed, the quiet curiosity that had spread through the cafeteria followed many of the inmates back into cell block C. Aliyah Brooks walked with the same steady pace she had shown since arriving that morning. She kept her eyes forward and her shoulders relaxed while the hallway lights reflected off the polished concrete floor beneath her shoes. To someone unfamiliar with prison life, the corridor might have looked ordinary, just another hallway with gray walls and numbered doors. But to the women who lived there, every detail carried meaning. Every glance, every whisper, every shift in tone could change how a person was treated for weeks or even years. As the group entered the housing block, Tanya Morris slowed her steps until she was walking beside the new arrival. Tanya studied Aliyah carefully before speaking. She had spent enough time inside Redstone to recognize when someone did not quite fit the usual pattern. Most new inmates arrived tense and uncertain, their eyes moving constantly as they tried to memorize faces and rules. Aliyah did not behave that way. Her movements were measured and deliberate, like someone who had already decided that panic would not solve anything. Tanya finally broke the silence and asked the new girl a simple question about where she had been transferred from. Aliyah answered politely and said that she had come from a smaller county facility about 200 miles away. Her voice was calm and steady. She did not offer extra details and she did not ask many questions in return. Tanya noticed that too. People inside prison often shared stories quickly because talking helped pass the time. But Aliyah seemed comfortable with silence. A few steps ahead, Derek Collins walked with his usual group of followers, though his laughter sounded slightly forced now. Every few seconds he glanced over his shoulder, not directly at Aliyah but close enough that anyone paying attention could see he was still thinking about the moment in the cafeteria. One of his friends asked what had happened earlier. Derek shrugged and brushed the question aside with a dismissive comment, though his tone lacked the certainty that usually filled his voice. When they reached the entrance to the housing unit, the guard on duty checked the roster and waved everyone inside. The block smelled faintly of detergent and old concrete, a mixture that had become familiar to anyone who spent long enough within these walls. Rows of metal railings lined the upper level while narrow walkways connected the cells on each tier. Aliyah paused briefly as she stepped inside, her eyes moving slowly across the structure as if she were memorizing the layout. Tanya noticed the careful way she observed the room. It was not the nervous glance of someone afraid. It looked more like quiet awareness. Tanya finally asked the question that had been forming in her mind since lunch. She asked Aliyah whether she had experienced trouble with inmates like Derek before. Aliyah looked at her for a moment and then gave a small thoughtful nod. She said that people sometimes made quick judgments when they believed they understood someone at first glance. Then she added something that surprised Tanya even more. Aliyah said that those judgments often revealed more about the person making them than about the person being judged. Tanya studied her expression, realizing that the calm confidence she had seen earlier was not accidental. And somewhere across the room Derek Collins leaned against the railing of the upper tier, watching the new arrival again with a quiet suspicion that he could not quite shake. The afternoon hours inside cell block C moved slowly, the way time often does inside prison walls where every routine repeats day after day. After the lunch movement ended, most inmates settled into their usual patterns. Some sat on the lower tier benches talking quietly, others leaned against the railings of the upper walkway watching the block below like spectators at a long, predictable show. The overhead lights hummed softly above the concrete floor while a guard near the entrance desk reviewed paperwork without looking up very often. Aaliyah Brooks stood near the staircase for a moment, taking in the rhythm of the room with calm attention. She had already learned that every housing block developed its own invisible structure of influence. Inside Redstone, those structures mattered more than the official rules printed on the walls. Tanya Morris leaned against the railing beside her and spoke in a low voice that carried the tone of someone offering practical advice rather than gossip. She explained that cell block C had its own internal order and that most people understood it without needing to discuss it openly. Derek Collins stood at the center of that order. He had arrived at Redstone several years earlier and had slowly built a reputation that discouraged most people from questioning him. Derek did not control the block through official authority. Instead, he controlled it through presence, confidence, and the simple fact that people preferred to avoid unnecessary trouble. When Derek spoke, most inmates listened. When he chose a table in the cafeteria, others usually found another place to sit. Tanya explained this quietly, not with fear but with the practical tone of someone describing the weather. Aaliyah listened without interrupting. She nodded once as if acknowledging the information and then glanced across the block toward the upper tier. Derek Collins stood there leaning casually against the metal railing, talking with two other inmates who had followed him since the cafeteria. His voice carried easily across the open space, loud enough to remind everyone that he was still the most confident presence in the room. But now and then his attention drifted back toward the staircase where the new arrival stood. Tanya noticed the glance and gave a small sigh. She said that Derek usually lost interest in new arrivals after a few hours unless something unusual happened during the first meeting. Today had clearly been unusual. Aaliyah considered this for a moment before responding with a quiet sentence that surprised Tanya again. She said that confidence built on reputation often needed constant attention to remain strong. Tanya studied her expression, realizing that the new girl spoke about the situation as if she had seen similar environments before. Across the block, Derek finished his conversation and pushed away from the railing. His footsteps echoed lightly on the metal walkway as he moved toward the stairs. Several inmates noticed the movement immediately. Inside a prison environment, people learn to read small signals quickly, and Derek rarely walked across the block without a reason. He descended the staircase with slow, deliberate steps until he reached the lower level. The room did not fall silent, but the conversation softened slightly as more eyes turned in that direction. Derek stopped a few feet away from Aaliyah and folded his arms with a confident smile that suggested he had regained his usual control of the situation. For a brief moment no one spoke. The quiet tension that had first appeared during lunch seemed to return, stronger now that the entire housing block could see what was happening. And somewhere in the back of the room a few inmates exchanged looks that carried the same unspoken question. They wondered whether the quiet girl standing near the staircase was about to become part of the story everyone inside cell block C would be talking about for the rest of the week. Derek Collins stopped a few feet away from Aaliyah Brooks, and for a moment the entire lower tier of cell block C seemed to hold its breath. He did not raise his voice and he did not rush the moment. Derek had learned long ago that presence alone could control a room if it was used correctly. He tilted his head slightly and looked at Aaliyah with a half smile that carried the quiet confidence people in the block recognized immediately. Several inmates nearby leaned casually against the railings pretending to continue their conversations, but their attention had already shifted. Moments like this were rarely announced. They simply unfolded while everyone watched. Derek finally spoke in a calm tone that sounded almost friendly. He said that the new girl had made quite an impression during lunch earlier. His words drew a few quiet chuckles from the inmates standing behind him, though the laughter sounded uncertain. Aaliyah looked at him for a moment without changing her posture. She stood relaxed with her arms resting at her sides, as if the attention surrounding them did not interest her very much. Tanya Morris remained nearby but slightly behind her, observing carefully. Tanya had spent years studying the small signals people gave when pressure started building. What surprised her most was that Aliyah showed none of the usual signs. No quick breathing. No shifting weight from one foot to another. No nervous glances toward the guards. Instead, she watched Derek with the same calm awareness she had shown since arriving. Derek continued speaking, his voice still smooth and measured. He explained that every housing block inside Redstone had a certain way of doing things and that new arrivals usually benefited from understanding those unwritten rules early. His tone suggested he was offering advice rather than a warning. A few inmates nodded along quietly. Derek had delivered speeches like this before and most new inmates accepted the message quickly. Aliyah listened without interrupting. When Derek finished, she gave a small thoughtful nod as if acknowledging his explanation. Then she answered with a calm sentence that immediately changed the mood of the conversation. She said that she appreciated clear information because it helped people avoid misunderstandings. Her voice remained steady and respectful. But there was something unusual in the way she spoke, a quiet confidence that made it difficult to interpret her words as submission. Derek paused for a moment, studying her expression more closely now. He had expected nervous agreement or defensive sarcasm. Instead, he found calm cooperation. The difference created a small crack in the rhythm of the interaction. Several inmates noticed the hesitation immediately. Derek leaned slightly closer and asked where she had learned to stay so relaxed in a place like this. Aliyah considered the question before answering. She said that she had spent many years learning how people react when they believe someone else is weaker than they are. Her words were quiet but clear enough for the nearby inmates to hear. The statement carried no anger and no challenge. It sounded more like a simple observation. Derek straightened again and folded his arms, studying her more carefully now. Around them the low conversations in the housing block continued, but the invisible circle of attention surrounding the two of them remained strong. And as Derek Collins watched the quiet newcomer standing calmly in front of him, he began to realize that whatever story had started in the cafeteria earlier was far from finished. Derek Collins remained standing in front of Aliyah Brooks for a few quiet seconds after her answer, and the stillness that followed seemed to stretch across the entire lower tier of cell block C. People nearby continued moving and talking, but the energy around the two of them had shifted again. Derek had spent years reading people quickly. It was one of the reasons he had managed to build influence inside Redstone. Confidence, fear, hesitation, anger. Most emotions revealed themselves in predictable ways if someone paid close enough attention. But Aliyah Brooks was different. The more he studied her expression, the harder it became to categorize what he was seeing. She was not challenging him, but she was not avoiding him either. She simply stood there with a quiet patience that made the moment feel oddly balanced. Derek finally let out a short breath and gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they want to reclaim the rhythm of a conversation. He said that most people inside this block preferred simple conversations rather than philosophical observations. A few inmates behind him laughed lightly at the comment. The sound carried through the room, though the laughter still felt cautious. Aliyah did not react to the remark. Instead, she looked briefly toward the upper tier railings where several other inmates were now watching openly. Then she returned her attention to Derek. She spoke again, her voice calm and steady. She said that she understood simple conversations very well and that she had no interest in causing unnecessary problems. Tanya Morris watched carefully from a step behind her. Tanya could feel the tension moving through the room the same way someone might feel the pressure in the air before a thunderstorm. Derek nodded slowly as if acknowledging the statement. Then he asked a question that sounded casual but carried a sharper edge beneath it. He asked Aliyah why someone so calm had ended up inside a place like Redstone in the first place. Several nearby inmates leaned slightly closer, sensing that the conversation had reached an important moment. Aliyah paused for a second before answering. She did not seem offended by the question. Instead, she responded in the same thoughtful tone she had used before. She explained that sometimes people made decisions in difficult situations and those decisions followed them longer than expected. Her answer revealed very little, but the calm honesty in her voice made it difficult to dismiss. Derek studied her carefully, searching for the usual signs of insecurity that often appeared when someone tried to hide part of their story. But again he saw none. Around them the housing block continued its slow afternoon routine. A guard walked along the upper walkway checking doors while the low hum of conversation filled the background. Derek finally stepped half a pace closer and looked directly into Aliya's eyes. For a brief moment the confident expression he had worn all afternoon softened into something more thoughtful. He said that Redstone had a way of revealing what people were really made of. The statement hung in the air between them like a quiet challenge. Aliya did not step back and she did not respond with another speech. She simply met his gaze and gave a small nod, as if she had heard the same statement many times before in different places. And somewhere in that silent exchange Derek Collins began to understand that the calm woman standing in front of him might not be someone he could easily intimidate or predict. The silence that followed Derek Collins's final words lingered longer than anyone expected. For a brief moment neither he nor Aliya Brooks moved, and the air inside cell block C seemed to grow heavier with quiet attention. Around them the afternoon routine continued, but the people closest to the staircase had already slowed their conversations enough to hear what would happen next. Derek studied Aliya one more time, then gave a small shrug as if the conversation had reached its natural end. He stepped back half a pace and said that everyone inside Redstone eventually found their place. Some learned quickly. Others needed time. With that he turned slightly toward the staircase, signaling that the exchange was finished. The invisible circle of attention around them began to loosen. A few inmates resumed their conversations while others leaned back against the railings pretending they had not been watching closely the entire time. Tanya Morris exhaled slowly and gave Aliya a quiet look of surprise. She said that most new arrivals never managed to hold Derek's attention that long without the conversation turning unpleasant. Aliya responded with a small thoughtful smile and said that people often expected conflict when they walked into unfamiliar situations. She explained that sometimes calm responses could confuse those expectations more than anger ever could. Tanya shook her head slightly, still studying the newcomer with growing curiosity. The two women walked toward the lower tier benches while the block returned to its usual rhythm. But the story did not end there. High above them on the upper walkway, another inmate named Carla Jennings had been watching the entire exchange from the railing. Carla had lived inside Redstone long enough to remember things most people forgot. As she leaned forward and spoke quietly to the woman beside her, a piece of information surfaced that changed the meaning of the afternoon conversation entirely. Carla said that the name Aliya Brooks sounded familiar. She had once seen that name years earlier in a local newspaper article that circulated through the prison library. According to Carla, the article had described a young athlete from Atlanta who had won several national-level martial arts competitions before her career suddenly disappeared from public view. The woman beside her raised an eyebrow and asked whether Carla was certain. Carla nodded slowly and said that she rarely forgot names connected to unusual stories. Down below, Aliya and Tanya had just reached the bench near the wall when a few nearby inmates began whispering quietly about what Carla had said. Rumors inside prison moved faster than official announcements, and within minutes the name Aliya Brooks was traveling through cell block C in a new and unexpected way. Derek Collins heard the whispers as he reached the middle of the staircase. He paused and looked back toward the lower tier where Aliya now sat calmly beside Tanya. The confident expression on his face remained, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the new information spreading across the block. If the rumor was true, the quiet newcomer might not only possess unusual confidence but also a history none of them had fully understood yet. And as the afternoon light filtered through the narrow windows above the cell block, one thing became clear to everyone paying attention. The calm woman who had arrived that morning carried a past far more complicated than anyone in Redstone had expected. The quiet rumor that began on the upper walkway continued moving through cell block C like a slow current, passing from one conversation to another until nearly everyone in the room had heard some version of the same surprising detail. The name Aliya Brooks no longer belonged only to the quiet newcomer who had walked into the cafeteria earlier that afternoon. Now it carried a story, and stories inside prison traveled farther than facts. Tanya Morris sat beside Aliyah on the bench near the wall, watching the subtle shift in the block with the experienced eyes of someone who understood how quickly perception could change inside a closed environment. A few minutes earlier the attention had centered on Derek Collins and the reputation he controlled. Now that attention had begun drifting somewhere new. Tanya leaned closer and asked Aliyah quietly whether the whispers traveling across the room had any truth behind them. Aliyah listened without reacting immediately. She rested her hands loosely on her knees and looked across the block where groups of inmates were pretending to continue their usual conversations while clearly discussing the same rumor. Finally she gave a small thoughtful nod. She said that before everything in her life had changed she had spent many years competing in martial arts tournaments across the country. She explained it without pride and without regret, the way someone might describe a chapter of life that belonged to a different time. Tanya raised her eyebrows slightly and let out a low breath of surprise. The calm confidence she had sensed earlier suddenly made perfect sense. Across the block Derek Collins remained halfway up the staircase, leaning against the metal railing while he watched the quiet exchange below. The whispers had reached him as well, and although his posture still projected confidence, the thoughtful expression in his eyes revealed that he was reconsidering the entire situation. Derek had built his reputation on understanding the balance of power inside the block. But reputation depended on perception, and perception could change the moment new information appeared. Aliyah stood up slowly from the bench and stretched her shoulders with relaxed ease. She did not look like someone interested in proving anything to anyone. Instead she turned toward the narrow corridor leading to the cells as if the conversation had already reached its natural conclusion. Tanya followed beside her, still processing what she had learned. As the two women walked across the floor, several inmates stepped aside instinctively, not out of fear but out of a quiet respect that had not existed earlier that day. The afternoon light filtered through the high-security windows and cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Derek watched them go without speaking. For the first time since the new arrival had entered his block, he understood that the balance of the room had shifted in a way no one could ignore. Yet the most unusual part of the entire moment was not the rumor, the whispers, or the changing attention of the inmates around them. The most unusual part was Aliyah herself. She had not tried to challenge Derek Collins. She had not tried to prove strength or claim authority. She had simply remained calm when everyone expected something else. And sometimes inside a place like Redstone Women's Correctional Facility, calm confidence could change a room more completely than any show of force ever could. As the afternoon routine continued and the loudspeaker announced the next movement schedule, one quiet understanding settled across cell block C. The newest inmate had arrived without noise, without threats, and without ambition. Yet by the end of a single afternoon she had already done something few people ever managed to do. She had made the entire block look at her twice.